Welcome everybody to chapter 13 of the Gospel of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Today we are doing chapter 13, a history of heretics. Everyone knows that pirates are badass, but history is also full of non-Pastafarians who have dared to rock the boat, challenging the limits of religious and scientific dogma alike. With this in mind, we offer this rundown of heretics through time. Their poor lives illustrate just how hard a world without FSMism can be. Starting with Aristotle, a New Age philosopher. Aristotle was born in northern Greece a really long time ago. He was the son of a wealthy and influential doctor and studied under Plato, who was also the son of a wealthy and influential doctor. Thus began the Greek tradition, a key forebear to contemporary Western thought, which holds that the wealthy and influential shall grow even more wealthy and influential, while the poor and influential grow poorer and increasingly less lose their fluent. Because Aristotle dared to disagree with the teachings of Plato, he was not appointed head of the academy when Plato died. Angered by this snub, Aristotle took a tutoring job with a young Alexander the Great, whom he encouraged to follow his dream of raping, pillaging and eventually taking over the world. After that, Aristotle retired to his writings. It is said that Aristotle wrote over 150 treatises, although that is an awful lot of treatises. They can be summarized as follows. Everything in our world is composed of potential matter and of reality form. Like an uncarved block of marble, we have the potential to sculpt our lives and make them into whatever reality we wish. Today, this line of thought is referred to as freaky New Age shit. And contemporary scholars agree that if Aristotle were alive today, he would definitely be a fixture on Oprah. Aristotle has been a fan favorite of all the great thinkers throughout time. Not only was he a great philosopher, but he also developed a systematic classification of animals, which made him quite the Renaissance man. And it should be noted that his teachings experienced a real renaissance during the Renaissance. But there were dark clouds ahead for his Renaissance supporters. For although he talked a lot about God, he also declared that the universe was eternal, a belief that caused a lot of trouble about 1,000 years ahead after he died, when the Catholic Church finally started paying attention to all the Aristotle hype. Leonardo da Vinci, architect, musician, anatomist, New York Times best-selling author, inventor, vegan, engineer, homosexual, sculptor, painter and minor league stickball prodigy. Known as the original Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci came from humble origins. His father was a notary and his mother was a local peasant woman. Leonardo was raised on the hard streets of Florence, where he grew up quickly, learning to draw, paint, sculpt and invent before normal kids his age had ever seen a gun. He was also a closeted homosexual. Da Vinci began keeping journals early in his life. He wrote them in code, but his co-writer, Dan Brown, later translated much of what was inside. Though Da Vinci's journals, as well as surviving records, kept the Florence officers of the night, an anti-sodomy agency of the time, we have learned that Da Vinci enjoyed the company of adolescent boys and that he liked them young. He also became a vegan, having determined that milk-producing udders are homologous to a woman's breast, which of course he despised. But enough about his sexual preferences. Throughout Da Vinci's life, he managed to invent everything that's ever been used in a war. These include the helicopter, the hang glider, the tank, the machine gun, the cluster bomb, the robot and the submarine. Later he went on to invent the single-span bridge, the video game Halo and the gate that swings both ways. The Renaissance humanists saw no distinction between science and the art, and so Da Vinci didn't limit his brilliant imagination to just inventing things. He also painted such famous masterpieces as the Adoration of the Magi, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. He studied anatomy, designed festivals, sculpted and wrote music. He even arranged it so that his shit didn't stink. In short, he was awesome. We will not cover Da Vinci's problem with the Catholic Church, since everybody has already read the Da Vinci Code. Giordano Bruno deserved what he got. Originally born with the name Filippo in 1548, Giordano Bruno took his new name in 1565, when he became a Dominican friar at the monastery of Saint Domenico, near Naples. Eventually he was ordained a priest, which is slightly ironic considering that the church eventually did to him, but more on that later. Disliked by all who encountered him, Bruno became an avid reader of books. He read Plato, Copernicus, Thomas Aquinas, Averroes, Duns Scotus, Marsilio Ficino, Nicholas of Cusa, Nick Hornby and Isaac Asimov. It's a well-known fact that those who read books often develop some funny ideas, and history has shown this to be especially true of people from the olden days. Bruno became particularly influenced by his reading of Copernicus and Plato, so much so that he couldn't stop talking about them. In 1576, the Inquisition put Bruno on their 10 most wanted list. He escaped to Geneva, but this wasn't the last time the Inquisition would come calling. For a short period, Bruno joined the Calvinists, but he was unwilling to abide by their strict no-smiling policy. In 1579, he traveled to Toulouse, France, where for a while he enjoyed the protection of powerful French patrons. It was during this period that he completed the majority of his writing, including the Infinito Universo e Mondi, in which he argued that the stars were the same as our sun, that the universe was infinite, and that all universes were inhabited by intelligent beings, establishing Bruno as the first ever sci-fi geek. While still in France, Bruno gained fame for his prodigious memory. Although his ability to retain information might have been a direct result of his intensive reading habits, he really should have put down the books at this point and slipped into dispassionate ennui like the rest of the French. Instead, Bruno decided to go to England. In 1583 he sought a position at Oxford, but the people there judged him to be a know-it-all and Bruno was turned away. After petitioning to teach at a few other English schools, he came to learn the harsh reality of saying, "You only have one chance to make a good first impression." For the next couple of years it is believed that Bruno spied against Catholics in England. Posing as a Catholic priest, he purportedly took confessions from Catholics, then reported those confessions to English spy masters who saw to it that the Catholics were put to death under the persecutory laws of the time. Even if Bruno wasn't a heretic, he most surely had proved himself to be a major arsehole by this point, and well, deserving of a good burning. In 1585 Bruno returned to Paris. Within a year he had pissed off the Parisians and so he moved to Germany, where his reputation hadn't preceded him. In 1588 he was on his way to Prague, and it was growing clear that Bruno was running out of countries. Faced with the option of fleeing to Siberia or going back to Italy, Bruno stupidly accepted a brief teaching position at Padua in 1591. Unfortunately for him, the professorship he sought there went to Galileo Galilei. So he journeyed to Venice, where he pissed off one last person who then denounced him to the Inquisition. Bruno was arrested in May 22, 1592. It took 6 years before he stood trial in Rome, and when the Inquisitor Cardinal Rupert Bellarmine asked him if he still stood by his beliefs, Bruno is believed to have replied, "Does the Pope wear a funny hat?" And so, on February 17, 1600, a nail was driven through his tongue. Bruno was tied to a stake, and he was burned as a heretic. If only he'd kept his mouth shut. A tough lesson for sure. Charles Darwin, evolution's creepy little cook. In June 1837, more than 20 years before Charles Darwin published his famous, if highly flawed, treatise on the natural selection entitled On the Origin of Species, the young biologist self-published a lesser-known work, one that turned out to be his first step at reconciling his beliefs in science and religion. That book was On the Origin of Spaghetti Sauce. The early years, the probably mildly retarded Darwin grew up in Shrewsbury, England, the fifth of 6 children. He was the son of Robert Darwin, a well-to-do doctor, and Susanna Darwin, who was rumored to be a virtual magician in the kitchen. Throughout Darwin's life, this family dichotomy would tear at the very fabric of his being as pressure to excel in the natural science collided with his more homey desire to transmogrify the English culinary experience, a mission at which he ultimately failed. Darwin entered Edinburgh University in 1825 and was immediately astonished to discover that the university did not offer courses in the culinary arts. Tricked by his father into studying medicine, the dejected young Darwin resorted to cooking sumptuous dinners for himself in his boarding house. In his second year, he joined several student naturalist societies, and for a short time he was free to explore the shores of the Forth, collecting crustaceans for various culinary wonders, like linguine with clam sauce and penne with striped zebra mussels. Little did his fellow students realize that this creepy little cook would one day use these experiences as a springboard for one of the greatest revolutions in Western contemporary thought. While still at Edinburgh, Darwin produced his first scientific paper. Presented to the Plinian Society, it explained that the black spores found in oyster shells were the eggs of the common skate leech. Darwin shrewdly concluded that these spores were left by the flying spaghetti monster as a sign that even the lowliest of God's creatures could band together for a common cause. He was soundly laughed out of the Society's chamber, and shortly thereafter his father arranged to have him transferred from Edinburgh to Cambridge. Once he got to Cambridge, Darwin's father threatened to remove young Charles' colander and other kitchen utensils if he did not bear down and fully commit himself to his studies as a physician. But the young son was adamant that he would follow his dreams of culinary excellence. When he finally threatened his father with the prospect of abandoning the family and moving to France, the two Darwins arranged a secretive meeting in Paris, St. Sulpice Church, where it was determined that the young Darwin would pursue studies in theology. This seemed a sensible compromise, as clergymen were well paid and as most English naturalists were clergymen. Charles is widely believed to have told his father at the time, "If I cannot be allowed to explore the wonders of God's cookery, then let me at least explore the wonders of his creation." Charles Darwin applied himself at Cambridge, but was a C- student at best. In the summer after the first year at Cambridge, he was embarrassed by his poor showing, and sought any means possible to avoid going home during the break. He read a bunch of pamphlets and ultimately decided to take a Mediterranean cooking cruise, where he was promised the opportunity to explore and sample the various foods of Greece and southern Italy. But the voyage was ill-fated. Darwin suffered from food poisoning and seasickness, and ultimately he went home early. The only record of these sad days exists in a poorly penned and unpublished journal that he titled The Voyage of the Meatball. The Voyage of the Beagle. The Voyage of the Meatball nearly destroyed Darwin. He limped through his last years of studies, and following graduation did what any man armed with a Cambridge degree would do. He took a 5-year vacation to the Galapagos Islands, suffering from nervous exhaustion, and having lost all faith in humanity, Darwin was now determined to befriend as many of the world's animals as possible. It was aboard the HMS Beagle that life began to turn around for him. In a free gale off the coast of Tierra del Fuego, all of Darwin's cookbooks were washed overboard. Bored and suffering from severe skin rashes, young Charles picked up a book that would set his life on a new course. That book was Charles Lyell's Principle of Geology, which posited that geological features are the outcome of gradual processes that take place over eons of time. Something clicked in Darwin's head, and in that moment of clarity he realized that a slow-cooked sauce would be exponentially more delicious than one that was merely heated from a can. Something that had never before occurred to an Englishman. From this realization he gleaned some other ideas related to evolution, but he was really most excited about the sauce revelation. Within days the Beagle's cook was thrown overboard and Charles Darwin took over the ship's mess. There were mussels galore in South America, and Darwin thrived. On October 2nd, 1836, he returned to England as a minor celebrity, having discovered fossils, finches, tortoises, mockingbirds, and modern cooking. His book, The Voyage of the Beagle, was a hit, and he was invited to dinner parties throughout London, where he cooked and talked throughout many a night. Some of the proceeds from the Beagle book went towards self-publishing on The Origin of Spaghetti Sauce, in which Darwin put forth his theory of slow-cooked sauce and perfectly boiled noodles as a defined representation of the flying spaghetti monster. Sadly, the book never took off. Still, Darwin had his day job, was consisted of a little more than jotting down everything he noticed to that effect, and prompted by the fascinating structural similarities between earthworms and various forms of pasta. He began studying worms, and it is quite possible that this is the point where Charles Darwin finally descended into full-blown dementia. We will, however, never know the full truth, because Thomas Huxley, who had developed an unhealthy fascination with the fullness and length of Darwin's beard, took it upon himself to follow Darwin around in an attempt to defend his mindless rambling about worms. It was Huxley who convinced Darwin to stop arguing that humans were descended from worms, or in his image, as Darwin was often quoted as saying. Huxley convinced friends to claim that the lines of descent passed instead from monkeys, which he pointed out actually had appendages and bore an uncanny resemblance to certain people, including Darwin, who became known as Monkey Man. Once Darwin made the intellectual jump from worms to monkeys, his theory really took off. He was invited to many official scientific meetings where he was lauded as a genius by savants, and even scientists and philosophers. To this day, no one really knows why. The end of his life. In 1842, embarrassed by his fame and mortally disappointed by his inability to realize his life's ambition of being a professional chef, Darwin retreated to Down House in the London borough of Bromley. Write that damn egghead book, as he put it. He published On the Origin of Species in 1859, which was mostly about worms and the animals he'd befriended while vacationing in the Galapagos, rendering it completely unreadable. Later he wrote The Descent of Man, which Huxley changed to The Descent of Man without Darwin noticing. Destitute and nearly forgotten, Charles Darwin died in Downey, Kent, England on April 19, 1882. His beard was 8 feet long at the time. John Scopes, the ACLU's little monkey. On May 25, 1925, John T. Scopes was charged with violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which prohibited the teaching of evolution in Tennessee schools. Scopes was eventually found guilty and given the choice of paying a $100 fine or being pummeled with rotten fish and burned at the stake. After reflection, he chose to pay the fine. Scopes later admitted to reporter William K. Hutchinson that he had never actually taught his class about evolution, choosing instead to skip the lesson altogether. In fact, his most famous quote in Clintonesque, "I didn't violate the law." But if Scopes didn't teach evolution, how did this trial come about? As usual, the ACLU was behind it. It turns out that the lawyers from the ACLU had offered to finance a test case challenging the constitutionality of the Butler Act. Scopes became their unwilling monkey, and the lawyers started pouring into Tennessee by the hundreds. The defense team included Clarence Darrow, Dudley Field Malone, John Neal, Arthur Garfield Hayes, and Frank McElwee, among others. The prosecution included Tom Stewart, Herbert Hicks, Wallace Haggard, Ben and J. Gordon Mackenzie, William Jennings Bryan, and William Jennings Bryan Jr. Before the trial even started, the ACLU had met its objective of employing as many lawyers as possible, and the real tragedy of the Scopes monkey trial is not that it helped to promote the teachings of evolution, but it was an early model for our highly litigious society. After the trial, Scopes attended the University of Chicago, where he earned a master's in geology. He then went on to work for the oil industry, where in 1932 he met a young oil executive named Dick Cheney, who disclosed to Scopes that he would one day take over the world. Dolly the sheep. She was a whore. Codenamed 6LL3, this was the first mammal ever to have been successfully cloned from an adult cell. Produced at the Rosslyn Institute in Scotland, 6LL3, or Dolly, as she was named by the stockman who helped with her birth, was cloned by the technique of somatic cell nuclear transfer. Using a cell from an adult sheep's mammary, scientists placed a cell in a denucleated ovum and waited for the two cells to fuse. Eventually, the fused cells developed into an embryo, and on July 5, 1996, Dolly was born. "That sheep absolutely loved to shag," said Seamus McCracken, a top researcher. Other sheep stockmen, even the sheepdog, said she was insatiable. Scientists suspect that Dolly's libido was a result of her sense that she only had so much time in this earth. And indeed, she did suffer from shortened telomeres in her cells, which may have been passed on by her parents. Since Dolly's mother was 6 years old when the genetic material was taken from her, scientists speculate that in genetic terms Dolly was 6 years old when she was born. She had arthritis by the age of 5, lung disease by the age of 6, and a bad case of gonorrhea pretty much throughout. Hard facts for Dolly. And that concludes chapter 13. Next chapter would be propaganda, and that we leave for next video. This was a bit hard to read. I'm not really fluent with all these scientific names, but I promise you it will improve over time again. Thank you, and I hope to see you next video.